Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the great discussion at the Great Hall, God and Morality. Professor John Lennox is a professor of mathematics at the University of Oxford. He's a fellow in mathematics and the philosophy of science at Oxford. He's a lecturer at Wycliffe Hall, Oxford University, and also at the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. He has written extensively about the relationship between science and Christianity, as well as about new atheism. In fact, on that last note, he has debated the likes of Richard Dawkins several times, Peter Singer, as well as the late Christopher Hitchens. Ladies and gentlemen, please will you give a round of applause to Professor John Lennox tonight. And on my right, another man who needs no introduction, so I'll say a few things that are interesting for us here tonight about him. Eusebius McKaiser is an associate at the WITS Center for Ethics in the philosophy department. He's lectured philosophy in South Africa and in England. He did his master's thesis on moral objectivity. He's a talk radio host on Power FM. He's written 2 books, Ubuntu in My Bathroom and Can I Vote the DA, to which I'm still trying to get an answer from him. He's also a former World Masters debate champion. Please, will you put your hands together for Eusebius McKaiser. So like I said, tonight we're discussing God and morality and asking the question, is there a connection? So what I'm going to do first is I will start with you, John. What is your position on the existence of God, and how did you arrive at that conclusion?
Well, let me first say, ladies and gentlemen, what a delight it is to be in WITS University. When I first heard I was to have a discussion with Eusebius, I thought of an ancient bishop of Caesarea who was one of the towering intellectuals of the 3rd century. So I'm delighted that he's not come back from the 3rd century, but from the 21st, and is one of the people whom I'm delighted to hear is stimulating and probing his listeners to think. So we're very much on the same score there. So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to have such a worthy conversation partner, and I'm much looking forward to the discussion. Now, you asked me why I believe in God, and everybody's got a biography, and I'm from Northern Ireland. My parents were Christian, but they were not sectarian, which is very remarkable. My father employed equally across the Catholic-Protestant divide, got bombed for it. And one of the things I learned from my parents was this basic principle that all human beings are of equal value because they're made in the image of God. I saw from the start Christianity in a living form. And the interesting thing, it was not anti-intellectual, it was the exact opposite. It was expansive, it was open. It was my parents that first taught me and encouraged me to critically reflect on what I believed. Indeed, when I was 13, my dad handed me the Communist Manifesto. And he said, "Have you ever read this?" And I said, "No." And he said, "You better, because you need to get to know what other people think." So, second thing about my parents was they allowed me to think. And those are precious gifts. And so I first started seeing Christianity lived by people who were credible intellectually, morally, and of course later on as I grew, I investigated my faith, because my parents had taught me to do that, to see was there real rational as distinct from empirical underpinning. I became a mathematician and a scientist, and I remember discovering that my field of contemporary science owes its birth to Christianity. C.S. Lewis put it this way: men became scientific because they expected law of nature, and they expected law of nature because they believed in a lawgiver. That opened up a whole new world, that the basic faith of a scientist as Einstein put it, is in the rational intelligibility of the universe. And the grounding of that, for them, for Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and so on, was the fact that the universe had been created by a rational God. So, you see, I'm not ashamed of being a scientist and a Christian, because arguably Christianity gave me my subject. Now, in later years, I've investigated the whole question of rational intelligibility. Because, you see, I've come to the situation now where I believe that there's only superficial conflict between belief in God and science and deep concord. And there's only superficial concord between atheism and science, but deep conflict. And I'm coming rapidly to the conclusion that atheism and science don't mix at all, for the very simple reason that atheism undermines the very rationality we need to do science. But then, of course, in the moral sphere, which we're going to come to, the existence of objective moral values has always interested me. The fact that all around the world we have this common pool of morality, that's been noticed for a long time. And it was J.L. Mackie, who's very familiar, I think, to my discussion partner here in Oxford, and he was an atheist. He said that, you know, there is a pathway from the existence of objective morals to belief in God. Putting it another way, I think it's perfectly consistent not only to regard God as the ultimate grounding of rationality, but also as the ultimate, and I stress that word, grounding of morality. There is a reason why we all have very similar moral attitudes. For me, that is, to go back to my parents again, the fact that we're made in the image of God. Now, pragmatically, I've spent my life exposing my faith in God to its critical opposites. That has taken me particularly to East Germany during the Cold War, traveling there for 26 years, and then since 1989 spending a great deal of time in Russia, because I was interested in querying whether or not my belief in God was a product of Irish genetics. And that's always been thrown at me, and I may get it thrown at me tonight, but we'll see what happens when it is. The fact is, the more I've exposed my faith in God to its opposite, the more I've found it confirmed, because it deals with the big questions. Now, one of them, of course, is the moral impact of atheism when it's imposed on a nation. And how many Russian academics have said to me this: we thought we could get rid of God and retain a value for human beings, and we discovered too late that we couldn't. And it seems to me that is something that is highly non-trivial, because it is a massive part of 20th century history. And of course, Nietzsche got it dead right. He saw exactly what would happen when people got rid of God and thought they could retain a value for humans. And he said, you can't. And he would mock at the soft atheism of today that tries to retain the values of a Western liberal democracy and not of God. And he would say, wait and see what happens to that. But then there's more evidence. You asked before, Winston. You see, it now comes, we're going through various disciplines, science, ethics, and philosophy, and now I come to ancient history. Because you see, ladies and gentlemen, I sit as a Christian. Christianity is not a mere philosophy. It's geared into history, and it's geared into experience. So ancient history becomes enormously important for me. The ancient history of documents leading to a confidence in the authenticity of the New Testament record. But not only that, narrowing it, the ancient history and its helpfulness in getting to grips with the central claim of Christianity, which is that Jesus Christ rose from the dead the third day. That's why I sit here as a Christian, because I believe that this is evidence-based in terms of history. But not only in terms of history. Because if this claim is true, then it means, of course, logically, that Christ is still alive. And he made certain claims when he was on earth. For instance, he claimed that if people trusted him, they could receive forgiveness and a new life that would enable them to battle against all the mess that we battle against in our own lives and bring them peace and hope. Now, this is empirical. Does it actually work? And one of my biggest grounds for believing in God, and of course now I want to make precise the God I believe in. He's not the God of the gaps who disappears when you do a bit of science. This is the God of the whole show, who invented the whole universe, the bits of it that we understand and the bits we don't understand, the whole show. And it seems to me extremely important here that my faith is based, historical facts, my experiences as scientist, but above all, in the difference faith in Christ and God makes to my daily life. I've been married for 46 years. And I would owe the success of that relationship and many other relationships in life to the fact that it's got a focal point. It's got a transcendent point outside ourselves. Now, I've seen far too many times, well, not far too many times, not enough times, people being transformed from people who have no meaning in life, have no purpose in life. Some of them have been saved from suicide by coming to faith in God. It has transformed alcohol dependence into peace, happiness, and a bit of prosperity. And so, for me, the evidence that there is a God and that He's real and it is possible to have a relationship with Him comes cumulatively from every conceivable direction. And there are some very big things in there. All of us face the problem of pain and suffering. I have no simplistic answers to it. It's the hardest question I face, and yet I believe there's a way in through the death and resurrection of Christ that's not open to atheism. Atheism, of course, thinks it solved the problem by saying that's the way the universe is. But I notice it leaves the suffering and the pain, but it removes all hope. And so I sit here as a convinced believer in God, having spent my entire life from I was essentially a boy, asking the big questions, being self-critical as I can. One of the leitmotifs of my attitude to myself comes from Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize winner, who says, above all, be critical of yourself because you're the easiest person for yourself to deceive. So, ladies and gentlemen, those are one or two reasons for my believing in God.
Thank you so much, Professor. Eusebius, can we hear an amen from you? The same question, Eusebius, what is your position regarding the existence of God, and how, most importantly, did you arrive at that conclusion?
Thank you, Winston. Firstly, good evening to everyone, and thank you so much for being here. It really is an absolute privilege to have people turn out thinking it's worth coming to listen to a discussion between myself and John, and I really do appreciate that. Also, how's it to the people watching on YouTube tomorrow? And I'd like to thank the organizers for putting this together. An important reason why I accepted it was, firstly, I'm fascinated by Christians like John who self-examine and who think making your religious beliefs intelligible and justified is a burden they're willing to not only take on, but they think they can discharge. So it really is a privilege for me to be in conversation with you. And then finally to Winston, he's the one who first approached me. I want to up front also say thank you to him. Absolutely fantastic, a great mind himself. He's been on my radio show several times. He's a near perfect human being. He's only got two weaknesses. The one is that he's Christian. And the second, like the groom on last week's Our Perfect Wedding, he's heterosexual. How did I... Firstly, to answer your question, then I'll describe how I got to it, which is a very different biography to that of Professor Lennox. I do not believe in the proposition God exists. I describe myself as an atheist. I fight with good friends like philosopher Jacques Rousseau, who's here tonight, whether I should rather properly describe myself for philosophical and practical reasons as atheist. But that's a discussion I will bracket out for now. The important thing is I do not believe the claim God exists is a true claim. I was born into a family of Catholic adults. I had Catholicism imposed on me, much as many of you had Christianity imposed on you. So I wasn't a Catholic child who chose through reflection at the age of 13 to become an altar boy in Grahamstown at St. Mary's Catholic Church. That was just a fact of my family life. And so it continued. Embarrassment at the altar. I never went back to continue being an altar boy. I later did go through the first Holy Communion. I think I was in matric by then. And then the most marvelous thing happened. I went to Rhodes University, where leaders drink, and they choose really awesome subjects like philosophy. And what philosophy has taught me, which has fundamentally influenced who I am as a person, it's actually changed my character in the same way in which John's parents have had such a profound influence on his attitude towards his intellectual projects and personal beliefs, is that philosophy has taught me that evidence matters in your belief system. It's not to say, and John and I can both cite them and we'll agree on them, that there aren't examples of great Christian philosophers. I mean, indeed, even here in South Africa, one of my favorite lecturers, in case the others are watching on YouTube, was Francis Williamson at Rhodes University, who's deeply committed to his Catholicism. But broadly, what I've taken from my studies over the years in analytic philosophy is that it's a good thing, if you are interested in living the examined life, to have beliefs that track the evidence. And if they don't, then you have beliefs that are not warranted, that are unjustified, or that are simply false. And then I started examining my Catholicism that was imposed on me. And I realized that there isn't a shred of compelling evidence in favor of the proposition God exists. What I found instead, when I looked at my friends, including my philosophy friends, who remain committed to their Catholicism or their Christianity more broadly, like John, is that the kinds of arguments they provided did not meet the good standards that I had been taught by so many great epistemology lecturers that have taught me in philosophy. So I've heard what John said from my friends who are philosophers and Christian. I've heard descriptions about the amazing intelligibility of the universe, the awe that the probabilities are so incredibly low that this universe had to happen. I've heard the amazing thing about ultimate hope, what a difference it can make to save a marriage if you let God into it. I've heard all of that, but it never satisfied me, because the simple question is that the appropriate kind of evidence? And of course the answer is no, because what it does give you is pragmatism, in the same way in which taking ecstasy may really, really make you feel cool if you've gone through a painful journey. I'm not sure if it follows that it is a good thing to be addicted to ecstasy. So a description from my friends who were Christian about the functional purpose that this belief in God has played has never satisfied me as a philosopher, because it is not the sort of justification that tells me there's evidence, like there's evidence of this bottle in front of me, that can be observed, that can be experienced, that can be verified, that can be described in a manner that is open to someone who is skeptical at the outset of their dialogue. I've never come across that. What I've heard from folks who are Christian, whether they are ordinary folks or philosophers of science or mathematicians, I heard the same when John was in a beautiful conversation with my ex-colleague John Matham on Cape Talk last week, is almost ultimately, and I'll stop in a minute or two, that's been a nice provocative end to my opening remarks, almost an appeal to the beauty of the structure in the universe, plus high improbabilities that this universe had to come about. But it doesn't follow from that you can infer that God exists. Furthermore, Winston, even if you could conclude that only a supernatural being can account for what scientists can't account for in terms of why the Big Bang had to happen. And I don't think atheists can, which is why John and I, as we discovered over early dinner, have a lot in common in his critique of atheist scientists. But his Christian commitments do not follow from the shortcomings of science in not being able to account for why this universe had to come about. And that's something for me, as someone who wants to be, as we say in philosophy, but the jargon is unimportant, who wants to be a good epistemic agent, which just means someone who likes beliefs that are proportionate to the evidence. There's no evidence for that proposition, and that's why I simply could not get myself to commit to the statement, God actually exists. By contrast, two things. I'm very happy to not be certain at all about the origins of the universe. It is, for those of you who are nerdish about the distinction between agnostics and atheists, the very reason why I'm comfortable being an agnostic. I'm happy for clever people like John to be part of research projects at Oxford to try and make sense of whether a complete scientific account of the origins of the universe is possible, or whether indeed there can be a more satisfying set of evidence statements to people like myself who want empirical proof, for example, that God actually exists. But in the meantime, I don't need to take a view on the proposition God exists. But I am very firm, and this is where the idea that agnosticism is fence-sitting betrays a lack of education, I'm sad to say, doesn't mean that I don't have a view, that I'm scared to commit. I am comfortable with not committing to a proposition about which there isn't clear enough evidence. Now let me say a final thing about that. Even if it follows that it is a fair inference that a supernatural being has to account for the origins of the universe and therefore must exist, even if that's true, we still haven't got to your Christian God, I'm afraid, because the Christian God comes with bells and whistles, like being all-loving, but not being able to help the flu that I have currently, not intervening with TB, Joshua's building collapsing. So the most you get is a supernatural being. You do not even get the Christian God. So the Christian has an additional burden. If you want to rely on biology and high improbabilities to infer a supernatural being, the most you've got is the idea of a deity. We're still a long way away from the Christian God. And for those reasons, it would be utterly irresponsible of me, Winston, to be a Christian.
Well, thank you very much. Eusebius, am I correct in saying that, not to be reductionist here, but you've surveyed the evidence for the existence as well as the evidence for the non-existence of God, and you have found that not compelling to make a commitment to either one position?
Yes.
All right.
That's perfect.
Thank you very much. My question then to you, Professor John, is that you've heard Eusebius's position. Where exactly, just for us here, do you disagree with him, and could you help us follow?
I disagree with him at many points. I mean, it's very interesting to compare our backgrounds, and the forcing of Catholicism on people undoubtedly plays a role on antipathy sometimes to religion. But I'm going to leave that aside because I do so much approve of your point that evidence matters. I'm only interested in evidence-based faith. And you made the point that you haven't met arguments that don't meet the good standards. And you talked about probabilities. I never mentioned probabilities, actually. They weren't part of my argument. Because actually, I think the probability arguments are a little bit suspect. I mean, you and I are highly improbable, but we exist. At least I hope you believe you exist. So arguments from probabilities are a little bit weak. But I was very interested in your describing the bottle. You see the bottle's visible and it's full of water. And you haven't had any evidence like that, but I actually gave you some. If I see a home that's been destroyed by a row of vodka bottles, and the person trusts Christ that those vodka bottles are turned into mineral water, I think something real has happened, as real as your perception of that bottle. And I think that is hard evidence of the empirical kind, which is why I mentioned it. Now, I would want to say, I used the word cumulative. Let me bring it out again. I think since belief in God is not belief in a theory, it's belief in a person. And our response to persons is much more complex, much deeper, much more sophisticated, and we use all kinds of arguments. So it seems to me that I would accept your bottle, but I think I can give you many examples that go along with it. But you made a very interesting concession in the middle there. You say Christianity doesn't account for the shortcomings of science. That's not the way I look at it at all. Because that seems to be part of the intellectual fog that surrounds this whole debate. That science explains, and Christianity explains where science leaves off, so to speak. That's the God of the gaps, and no intelligent Christian or monotheist believes in the God of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. And I think one of the very big mistakes that Stephen Hawking makes lurks exactly here. You've got to choose between God and science. He's got two problems. He's got a problem with God. He thinks of God as a kind of Greek god of thunder that disappears with a little bit more science. But I don't believe in a God like that. Neither did Newton. And when he discovered the law of gravity, he didn't say, I've got a law of gravity, I've got the science, I don't need God. No. He said, what a brilliant God that did it that way. Because he doesn't regard God as the same kind of explanation that science gives. And I may be wrong, but what I got out of that statement was, you appear to do that. Secondly, the profound mistake, the second one that Hawking makes and Dawkins and so on, they fail to distinguish mechanism and agency, or law, mechanism, and agency. And they're asking us to choose between God and science. It's like me asking you to choose between Henry Ford and the law of internal combustion as the explanation for a motor car. You see, what I think the God question, the God answer, so to speak, is the ground of all our rationality. Now, I'd love to hear you tell me why you trust your own rationality, because I notice you're a very rational man.
Why, thank you.
So what's the basis of your faith in your own rationality?
Well, I've heard you, obviously I've stalked you on YouTube, trying very hard, John, I must say, to force some of your interlocutors to think that there is a salient way in which faith, which as it appears in religious thought, is perfectly similar to trust in one's rationality, or trust, for example, that you can eliminate skepticism about the reality of this bottle. And with the deepest intellectual respect, I think that you're being very naughty there, because some of the philosophical skepticism in metaphysics, I'll translate it into English in a second, is not of the same kind as the nature of some of the evidence-insensitive ways in which you describe to us how your belief in God has come about. So I want to pry that apart. I'm going to do that in a second. The other thing you do that I think you must stop imposing on poor Dawkins, and you do it effectively because Dawkins rightly deserves you to do this to him. But this is where Dawkins and I depart. I'm perfectly comfortable with the idea, and perhaps it's because I'm a humanities student, not a scientist, I'm perfectly comfortable with the fact that science can give us a mechanistic account at best, for example, the theory of evolution, of how we have evolved after the Big Bang has happened, but that it can never, and I've seen you effectively asking him this question, it hasn't as yet given an answer why the Big Bang had to happen at all, why did there have to be life, why did the universe have to come about. But what you then do, which is, from an argumentation point of view, to ascribe to your interlocutors what they are not saying, is that they are setting up this dichotomy between your God and a mechanistic account of human evolution. That is not true. That is not true. So what I can accept, for example, is the mechanistic account while remaining utterly agnostic to the mystery of why this thing called the Big Bang had to happen. You take on board a bigger evidential burden by coming up with an hypothesis without evidence, which I still await, and that hypothesis includes not just the concept of a supernatural being, but one that does amazing things inconsistent with your work as a scientist, like turning water into wine. Now, from a point of view of methodology in science, if we apply the idea that the simplest explanation is the best, then I'm afraid your atheistic scientists are on a better wicket here. But of course, us agnostics are even better because we're comfortable with not being able to account for how this mechanistic process started off that Dawkins keeps banging on about. But you want to extract the Christian God from the dissatisfaction of not being able to account for the origins of the universe. That is not evidence. That is not an argument. That is assertion.
That's incorrect. Yeah, it's okay.
Until you finish, you still got a bit more time, Eusebius.
Oh, keep going,
Well,
yes.
okay.
Sorry,
I could feel the audience appreciating the argument, so I really don't mind John intervening at that point. But to answer your last question, John, more directly about faith in rationality, I mean, here I really don't think we must bore the audience too much with technical philosophy, but the sense in which I can give an account of why it's a justified belief to believe that there's a bottle here cannot be described as a leap of faith in the same way in which believing that God can convert water into wine is a leap of faith in the sense of being evidence insensitive. Because there are processes in science that John is committed to as a scientist that he uses in peer-reviewed work to test the quality of fellow academics in the scientific community's permissibility into a journal that is top class. And those methods are methods of falsification, verification, observation. So if those are the standards that he imposes routinely when he wears his hat as a scientist, it's rather bizarre to me that they are absent in his acceptance that I can turn this water into a bottle of Four Cousins.
Well, that was a subtle change. I didn't talk about